I'm Dr. Miguel Rodriguez. I've been a trauma surgeon in Dallas, Texas for over 2 decades. My parents immigrated from Mexico, and while they raised me with deep faith, I became a man of pure science. No prayers, no miracles, just medicine. That was my world until October 15th, when everything I thought I knew crumbled in a single night. It was 11 at night when they rushed him in, 24 years old, construction worker. His name was David, and he'd fallen from a 4-story building. Internal bleeding, massive trauma, barely breathing. His wife Sarah was 8 months pregnant with their first child. She was crying in the hallway, begging anyone who would listen to save her husband. Before I continue, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Stories like this one reach farther than you imagine. The moment I saw David's scans, I knew we were fighting an impossible battle. His injuries were catastrophic. Multiple organ damage, severe internal bleeding, and his vital signs were dropping fast. Any other night, I might have prepared the family for the worst. But something about Sarah's desperate eyes made me push forward. I gathered my team. "This is going to be the most difficult surgery we've ever attempted," I told them. "His chances are less than 5%. My hands were steady, but inside, I was calculating the odds. Everything pointed to failure. As we prepped for surgery, I could hear voices in the hallway. Sarah had called their families. About 15 people had gathered. Parents, siblings, friends from their church. They formed a circle right there in the waiting room, and they began to pray. I remember rolling my eyes. These people thought their whispered words could change medical reality. I'd seen this countless times before. Families praying while their loved ones slipped away despite our best efforts. Prayer never saved anyone in my operating room. Only skill, technology, and sometimes luck did that. The surgery began at midnight. David's condition was worse than the scans had shown. The damage was extensive, and every minute that passed made his survival less likely. 3 hours in, his blood pressure dropped dangerously low. Then his heart rate became erratic. At 3 in the morning, the unthinkable happened. His heart stopped. We tried everything. Chest compressions, medications, electrical shocks. Nothing worked. The flat line on the monitor stretched on and on. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I looked at the clock. 3:17 in the morning. In my mind, David had died. I was about to call it when my surgical assistant whispered, "Doctor, the family is still praying outside." I glanced toward the operating room doors. Through the small windows, I could see them. Still there. Still praying. Sarah was on her knees, her pregnant belly making it difficult, but she wouldn't give up. Her mother-in-law had her hands on Sarah's shoulders, both of them crying, both of them whispering to God. Something inside me hesitated. 20 minutes without a heartbeat should have been the end, but I found myself saying, 5 more minutes. We try for 5 more minutes. My team looked at me strangely. In all my years of surgery, I'd never prolonged efforts this long. But I couldn't explain the feeling that washed over me. It wasn't medical instinct. It was something else entirely. We continued the compressions. 22 minutes. 23. 24. And then, at exactly 3:41 in the morning, something impossible happened. The monitor beeped. One single heartbeat appeared on the screen. My surgical nurse gasped. "Doctor, was that—" Before I could answer, another beep. Then another. Weak, but unmistakable. David's heart was beating again. I stared at the monitor in complete disbelief. In all my years of medicine, I had never seen a heart restart on its own after 24 minutes. It was medically impossible. Hearts don't just decide to beat again. But there it was, getting stronger with each passing second. "What just happened?" my anesthesiologist whispered. I had no answer. None of us did. The rest of the surgery passed in a blur of focused intensity and quiet amazement. David's vital signs stabilized. The bleeding stopped. Everything that should have gone wrong started going right. By 6 in the morning, we had successfully completed what should have been an impossible operation. But as I walked out to speak with the family, I knew I had to deliver difficult news. Even though David had survived the surgery, the damage from being without oxygen for 24 minutes would be severe. Brain damage was almost certain. He would likely never be the same person Sarah had married. The family was still there. They'd been praying for 7 straight hours. When Sarah saw me approaching, she struggled to her feet, her eyes searching my face for any sign of hope. The surgery was successful, I began carefully. David is alive. The waiting room erupted in tears of relief and gratitude. But I had to continue. However, I need you to understand something very important. David's heart stopped for 24 minutes during the surgery. The lack of oxygen to his brain will likely cause significant damage. When he wakes up, he may not be the man you remember. I'm sorry, but you need to prepare for severe complications. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, doctor, but he's alive. God brought him back to us. I wanted to tell her it wasn't God. It was medicine, persistence, maybe luck. But standing there, looking at this family who had prayed through the impossible, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. David spent the next 3 days in a medically induced coma. His brain scans showed concerning signs, swelling, potential damage in critical areas. I prepared his family for the worst possible outcomes: memory loss, cognitive impairment, possible paralysis, difficulty speaking. The textbooks were clear about what 24 minutes without oxygen meant. On the 4th day, we began bringing David out of the coma. I'll never forget the moment he opened his eyes. Sarah was holding his hand, whispering softly to him. His mother-in-law was in the corner, still praying quietly. And when David's eyes fluttered open, the first thing he did was squeeze Sarah's hand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. She gasped, leaning closer. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." "The baby?" he asked, his eyes moving to her belly. "The baby's fine," she sobbed. "We're all fine." I stood in the doorway, watching this reunion unfold, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. A chill ran down my spine, but it wasn't from the air conditioning. It was from witnessing something that challenged every rational explanation I could offer. Over the next several days, I ran every test imaginable. Cognitive assessments, motor function tests, memory evaluations, brain imaging. I was looking for the damage that had to be there. The damage that medical science said would be there. But the results kept coming back normal. Day 5. His memory was intact. He remembered Sarah, their wedding day, even small details from the week before his accident. Day 6. His motor functions were perfect. He could move his fingers, his toes, follow complex commands without hesitation. Day 7. Cognitive tests showed no impairment whatsoever. His thinking was clear, his reasoning sharp, his personality unchanged. By the end of the first week, I was staring at test results that made no medical sense. This man should have been severely disabled. Instead, he was asking when he could go home to help prepare the nursery for their baby. I found myself alone in my office at 2 in the morning, studying David's case files over and over again. The timeline was undeniable. 24 minutes without a heartbeat, 24 minutes without oxygen to his brain, and yet 0 neurological damage. I thought about my mother, kneeling by my bedside all those years ago, whispering prayers for her son who wanted to heal people. I thought about Sarah's family, praying for 7 straight hours while I fought to save David's life. I thought about that moment at 3:41 in the morning when a dead heart decided to beat again. For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't explain what I had witnessed with science alone. On David's 10th day in the hospital, something happened that shook me even more. I was making my morning rounds when I found Sarah sitting beside his bed, both of them laughing quietly together. David was telling her a story about something that happened at his construction site 2 months ago. Every detail was perfect, every memory crystal clear. "Dr. Rodriguez," David called out when he saw me. "Sarah tells me you saved my life." I walked closer to his bed, still struggling to process what I was seeing. This man should have been a completely different person. Yet here he was, joking with his wife, remembering conversations from months ago, showing no signs whatsoever of the brain damage that should have been inevitable. "How are you feeling today, David?" I asked, pulling out my pen light to check his pupils. "Honestly, I feel incredible," he said, following the light perfectly with his eyes. "Better than I felt before the accident, if that makes sense. It's like everything is sharper, clearer. I keep thinking about how blessed we are. Blessed. That word hit me differently than it would have 2 weeks earlier. I spent the next hour running additional tests. Balance, coordination, complex problem-solving tasks. David passed everything with flying colors. There was absolutely no indication that his brain had ever been deprived of oxygen for nearly half an hour. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called my mother. "Mijo," she answered, the warmth in her voice instantly taking me back to childhood. What a surprise. You never call during work hours. "Mom," I said, sitting in my office chair, staring out at the Dallas skyline. "Do you still pray for me?" She was quiet for a moment. "Every single day, Miguel. Every morning and every night." "Why do you ask?" I told her about David. About the surgery, the flatline, the impossible recovery. I told her about the family praying in the hallway while I fought to restart a dead heart. I told her about test results that defied every medical textbook I'd ever studied. When I finished, she was crying softly on the other end of the line. "Mijo," she whispered, "God has been waiting for you to see him. He never left you. You just stopped looking." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the timeline of events. David's heart had stopped at 3:17 in the morning. For 24 minutes, he was clinically dead. But at 3:41, the exact moment when I was ready to give up, when I was about to call the time of death, his heart had started beating again. I realized something that sent chills through my entire body. That family had been praying for exactly 7 hours when David's heart restarted. From 8:41 in the evening, when they first formed their prayer circle, until 3:41 in the morning, when the impossible happened. 7 hours of continuous prayer, ending at the exact moment life returned to David's body. Coincidence? I'd built my entire career on believing in coincidences, in statistical probabilities, in rational explanations for everything. But this felt like something else entirely. David was discharged on day 12. As I signed his release papers, he asked to speak with me privately. "Doctor," he said, his voice serious but calm, "I need to tell you something. During the surgery, when my heart stopped, I wasn't unconscious." I looked up from the paperwork. "What do you mean?" "I was somewhere else," he continued. "I can't really explain it, but I was in this place filled with the most beautiful light I've ever seen. And there was this voice, gentle but powerful, telling me it wasn't my time. That Sarah and our baby needed me, that I had to go back. I felt my hands begin to shake slightly. David, that's not medically possible. You were under anesthesia and your brain wasn't receiving oxygen." He smiled. "I know it sounds crazy, doctor, but I also know what I experienced. And I need you to know something else. While I was in that place, I saw someone praying for you." My pen stopped moving across the paper. "What?" An older woman looked like she could be Mexican or Central American. She was kneeling, crying, asking God to open your eyes, to help you see that he's real. She said you were her son, and she'd never stopped believing God would find a way to reach you. I stared at David in complete shock. The description he'd given matched my mother perfectly, but there was no way he could have known about her prayers, about anything related to my family. "David," I said slowly, "have you ever met my mother?" "No, sir, but in that place I knew exactly who she was, and I knew I was supposed to tell you that her prayers are being answered." 3 weeks later, I was in my office when I received the call that would complete my transformation. It was Sarah, and she was crying. But this time, they were tears of pure joy. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I wanted you to be the first to know. I just gave birth to our daughter. She's perfect, absolutely perfect. Congratulations, Sarah. How's David doing?" "He's incredible. He's holding our little girl right now, crying and thanking God for this miracle. Doctor, we want to name her Michelle, after the Archangel Michael. We believe God sent you to be our guardian angel that night." After I hung up the phone, I sat alone in my office for a long time. A construction worker who should have died had lived. A brain that should have been damaged was functioning perfectly. A family that should have been broken was now complete. welcoming their first child into the world. I thought about the moment when David's heart had stopped. I thought about that family praying in the hallway. I thought about my mother, thousands of miles away, kneeling beside her bed every night, whispering prayers for her son who had lost his faith. And I thought about that voice David claimed to have heard, telling him it wasn't his time to go. That evening, for the first time in over 20 years, I drove to St. Mary's Cathedral in downtown Dallas. I walked into the sanctuary where my parents had taken me as a child, where I'd received my first communion, where I'd once believed in miracles before science convinced me they didn't exist. I knelt in the front pew, exactly like my mother had taught me all those decades ago. And for the first time since medical school, I prayed. "God," I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty cathedral. "I don't know if you can hear me. I've spent so many years believing you weren't real. But what I saw that night, what happened to David, I can't explain it any other way. If you're really there, if you really saved that young man's life, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for doubting you. I'm sorry for thinking I had all the answers." As I sat there in the silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Peace. Complete, overwhelming peace. The kind of peace that comes not from understanding everything, but from accepting that some things are beyond human understanding. I called my mother that night. "Mom," I said when she answered, "I went to church today." She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom? Are you there?" "I'm here, mijo," she whispered, and I could hear her crying. "I've been praying for this day for 23 years. God never stopped working on your heart, even when you stopped listening." "I know, Mom. And I think he used a young construction worker named David to get my attention." The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in my medical career. David's case became the talk of the hospital. Other doctors would stop me in the hallways, asking about the impossible recovery in the trauma unit. Word spread quickly through the medical community. A patient who'd been clinically dead for 24 minutes had walked out of the hospital with 0 neurological damage. Dr. Patricia Chen, our head of neurology, cornered me one morning with David's brain scans in her hands. "Miguel," she said, shaking her head in disbelief, "I've been practicing neurology for 30 years. These scans should show massive brain damage. Instead, they're perfect. Better than perfect, actually. His neural activity is remarkably strong." I looked at the images she was showing me. Clean, healthy brain tissue with no signs of oxygen deprivation. "What's your medical explanation, Patricia?" She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's just it. I don't have one. According to everything we know about neuroscience, this man should be in a vegetative state. Instead, he's planning his daughter's nursery and returning to work next month." These conversations happened daily. Fellow surgeons, nurses, residents, everyone wanted to understand what had occurred in Operating Room 7 that October night. But the more I tried to explain it in purely medical terms, the more inadequate those explanations felt. 3 weeks after David's discharge, I was finishing my evening rounds when I encountered something that would deepen my transformation even further. Mrs. Garcia, an elderly woman from my old neighborhood, had been admitted with complications from diabetes. As I checked on her, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said in heavily accented English, "you are Maria Rodriguez's son, yes?" I nodded, surprised. "Yes, ma'am. Do you know my mother?" Her eyes lit up. "We pray together every Tuesday at St. Mary's. She talks about you all the time. She says you're a surgeon, but she worries because you don't believe in God anymore." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Mrs. Garcia, No, she interrupted gently. "She also says she never stops praying for God to show you a miracle. Something so big you can't ignore it." She squeezed my hand tighter. "I think maybe he already has, yes?" That night, alone in my office, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Garcia's words. My mother had been telling her prayer group about me. A group of elderly Latina women had been praying for my spiritual awakening every Tuesday for years. And 3 weeks ago, their prayers had been answered in Operating Room 7. I picked up my phone and called David. It was 9 at night, but I needed to ask him something that had been weighing on my mind. "Dr. Rodriguez?" David answered, surprised. Is everything okay? David, I need to ask you about that experience you had during the surgery. The place with the light. You mentioned seeing an older man who knew my father's name. Yes, sir. Carlos. He was very clear about that. I took a deep breath. What else did he tell you? I need to know everything. David was quiet for a moment. Doctor, are you sure you want to hear this? Some of it might be hard to process. I need to know. Okay, David said softly. Carlos told me that you'd been running from God for 20 years, but that your calling as a healer was always part of his plan. He said your medical training, your skills, your position at the hospital, it was all preparation for moments when God would work miracles through your... I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes. David continued. He also said that your mother's prayers had been building a bridge between heaven and earth for decades, and that my accident was God's way of showing you that bridge was real. He told me to tell you that faith and science aren't enemies. They're partners in the work of healing. After that conversation, I knew I couldn't continue living in the space between belief and skepticism. I had to make a choice. Either everything that happened with David was an incredible series of coincidences, or God had orchestrated a miracle specifically to restore my faith. The next Sunday, I attended Mass at St. Mary's Cathedral for the first time since my father's funeral. As I walked into the sanctuary, I saw my mother sitting in our family's old pew, exactly where we'd sat when I was a child. She looked up as I approached, and her face broke into the most beautiful smile I'd ever seen. Mijo, she whispered as I sat beside her. You came home. During the service, the priest spoke about the healing miracles of Jesus. God doesn't perform miracles to show off his power, Father Martinez said from the pulpit. He performs them to reveal his love, to strengthen faith, and to remind us that he is always present, even in our darkest moments. As he spoke those words, I thought about operating room 7, about David's flatline, about prayers being whispered in a hospital hallway while I fought to restart a heart that had given up, about a construction worker's impossible recovery and a surgeon's impossible transformation. After Mass, I approached Father Martinez. Father, I'm Dr. Miguel Rodriguez. I wanted to speak with you about something that happened at the hospital. I told him David's entire story, about the accident, the surgery, the 24 minutes without a heartbeat, the perfect recovery, the spiritual experiences David described. Father Martinez listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more amazed with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. Doctor, he finally said, what you've described isn't unusual in the context of faith. God often uses medical professionals as instruments of his healing power. The miracle isn't that you saved David's life. The miracle is that God chose to work through you, and that you were open enough to recognize his presence. But I wasn't open to it, I protested. I was completely skeptical. I didn't believe in any of it. Father Martinez smiled. Sometimes God works through our faith. Sometimes he works despite our lack of faith. In your case, he used your skill and dedication as a surgeon, combined with a family's unwavering prayers, to create something beautiful. Your doubt didn't disqualify you from being part of God's plan. 1 month later, I faced another case that would test my newfound faith. A teenage girl named Emma was brought to the emergency room after a severe car accident. The damage was extensive, and like with David, the surgery required to save her life carried enormous risks. As I explained the situation to Emma's parents, I saw the same desperate fear I'd witnessed in Sarah's eyes. Emma's mother grabbed my hands and said, "Doctor, please, she's only 16. She has her whole life ahead of her." For the first time in my career, I found myself saying something I'd never said before. I'm going to do everything medically possible to save your daughter. And I believe in the power of prayer. If you'd like to pray while I operate, I think that would be a good thing. Emma's father looked shocked. You believe in prayer, doctor? I do, I said simply. I've seen what can happen when skilled medicine and sincere faith work together. As I scrubbed in for Emma's surgery, I heard them in the hallway. Emma's extended family, friends from her high school, members of their church. They'd formed the same kind of prayer circle I'd witnessed with David's family. And for the first time in my career, instead of rolling my eyes at their false hope, I found their presence comforting. God, I prayed quietly as I entered the operating room. If you're really there, if you really work through doctors like me, please guide my hands tonight. Help me save this young girl's life. Emma's surgery lasted 6 hours. It was complex, delicate work, requiring every ounce of skill I'd developed over 2 decades. But throughout the entire procedure, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A sense of calm confidence, as if I wasn't operating alone. The surgery was successful. Emma not only survived but made a complete recovery with no complications whatsoever. When she woke up 3 days later, her first words were, "Did someone pray for me? I had the most beautiful dream about angels." Her mother burst into tears. "Honey, we all prayed for you. The whole church prayed for you." Emma smiled weakly. I could feel it. I could feel all those prayers lifting me up. Standing there, watching this family reunion, I realized that my transformation was complete. I was no longer the skeptical surgeon who believed only in science. I was a man of faith who happened to be a surgeon, understanding that both my medical training and my spiritual beliefs were gifts meant to be used in service of healing. 6 months after David's miracle, Sarah called me with news that would bring our story full circle. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "I wanted you to be the first to know. We're pregnant again." I felt my heart skip with joy. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. How's David handling it?" "He's over the moon." "But doctor, there's something else. We've been talking, and we want to ask you something important." "What's that?" "Would you be willing to be the godfather to this new baby? You saved David's life, which means you saved our family. We can't think of anyone we'd rather have standing with us at the baptism." I was speechless. Godfather. Me, the former atheist who'd spent decades dismissing the very faith traditions I was now being invited to participate in. "Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored." 9 months later, I stood in the same small church where I'd witnessed Michelle's baptism, but this time as godfather to David and Sarah's son, whom they named Gabriel, after the archangel who brings messages from God. As Father Martinez performed the baptism ceremony, he spoke words that resonated deep in my soul. "We welcome Gabriel into God's family, a child born into a family that has witnessed miracles, raised by parents who understand the power of faith, and surrounded by a community that includes a godfather who learned to see God's hand in healing." Looking down at baby Gabriel in my arms, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the skeptical surgeon who'd almost given up on David, to the man of faith now promising to help guide this child's spiritual development. After the ceremony, David pulled me aside once more. "Doctor," he said, "I need to tell you one final thing about that night. Something I've been saving for the right moment." I braced myself for another revelation that would challenge my understanding of what had occurred. "When I was in that place of light, when I met your father Carlos, he gave me a message specifically for today, for Gabriel's baptism." My eyes widened. "What message?" David smiled. "He said to tell you that becoming Gabriel's godfather wasn't an accident, that God has more work for you to do, more lives for you to touch, more miracles for you to witness, and that your journey of faith is just beginning." As I held Gabriel in my arms, surrounded by the family whose prayers had changed my life, I felt a profound sense of purpose wash over me. I understood now that David's miracle hadn't just been about saving one man's life. It had been about awakening faith in a doctor who would go on to touch countless other lives with that same combination of medical skill and spiritual understanding. Today, 2 years after that remarkable October night, I practice medicine differently. I still use the same surgical techniques, the same medical knowledge, the same commitment to excellence that I always had. But now, I also pray with families before difficult surgeries. I hold hands with scared relatives in waiting rooms. I speak openly about the role of faith in healing, not as a substitute for medicine, but as a partner to it. My colleagues have noticed the change. Some are curious, asking questions about how I've integrated faith into my medical practice. Others are skeptical, viewing my transformation with the same doubt I once held. But I've learned that faith isn't about convincing others. It's about being open to the miraculous in your own life. I think about David often, about that family praying in the hallway, about 24 minutes when time stood still and science reached its limits, about the moment when the impossible became possible, when death surrendered to life, when prayers were answered in ways that no medical textbook could explain. David returned to construction work 6 months after his accident. He's stronger than ever, working on a new housing development in North Dallas. Sarah sends me photos of Michelle and Gabriel regularly, 2 children who exist because their father's heart refused to stay still on a night when everything should have gone wrong. But perhaps the most significant change isn't in David's family. It's in mine. I call my mother every Sunday now, not just to check in, but to pray with her. She cries every time, thanking God for answering 23 years of prayers for her son's return to faith. "Mijo," she told me recently, "I always knew God would find a way to reach you. I just never imagined he would stop a man's heart for 24 minutes to do it." Last month, I was invited to speak at a medical conference about inexplicable recoveries in trauma surgery. As I stood before 200 of my peers, I realized I had a choice. I could present David's case as a medical anomaly, focusing on the technical aspects of the surgery and leaving out the spiritual dimensions. Or I could tell the complete truth about what I'd witnessed. I chose truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I'm going to share a case that challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries of medicine. But I'm also going to share something more personal. How this case changed not just my understanding of healing, but my understanding of faith itself." I told them about David, about the prayers, the impossible recovery, the spiritual experiences. I spoke about my own transformation from skeptic to believer. And I concluded with words that would have been unthinkable for me to say 2 years earlier. Science and faith are not opposing forces in the healing process. They are complementary aspects of a mystery that we, as physicians, are privileged to participate in. Sometimes our greatest role is not just to apply medical knowledge, but to remain open to possibilities that extend beyond our current understanding. The response was mixed. Some colleagues approached me afterward with their own stories of unexplainable recoveries. Others clearly thought I'd lost my scientific objectivity, but I no longer needed their approval or understanding. I'd witnessed something that transcended medical explanation, and that experience had made me a better doctor, not a worse one. 3 months ago, I received a call that brought my journey of faith full circle. David was on the line, but this time his voice carried urgent concern. "Doctor Rodriguez," he said, "I need your help. It's not medical, it's personal." "What's wrong, David?" "My father-in-law, Sarah's dad. He's been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The doctors say it's inoperable. They're giving him 3 months to live." I felt my heart sink. "David, I'm so sorry. What can I do to help?" "We want you to be there when we tell him about my miracle, about what happened that night. Sarah's father has been struggling with his faith since the diagnosis. He can't understand why God would let this happen to him. But we think hearing your story, hearing about how prayer and medicine work together to save my life, might help him find peace." 2 days later, I found myself sitting in the living room of Sarah's childhood home, facing a man named Robert Martinez who was dying of brain cancer. He was thin, exhausted from chemotherapy, but his eyes still held the same determination I'd seen in his daughter during David's crisis. "Dr. Rodriguez," Robert said, "my daughter tells me you saved her husband's life. She also tells me you didn't believe in God before that night." I nodded. "That's correct, Mr. Martinez. I was completely convinced that science was the only reality worth trusting." "And now?" I looked at David and Sarah, sitting together on the couch, baby Michelle playing quietly at their feet. "Now I understand that God works through science, through doctors, through medicine. But he also works in ways that medicine can't explain or predict." I told Robert about that October night, about the 24 minutes of flatline, about the family prayers that seemed to coincide with David's heart restarting, about the impossible recovery with 0 complications. When I finished, Robert was quiet for a long time. "Doctor," he finally said, "I've been angry at God since my diagnosis. I kept asking why he would give me cancer when I've tried to live a good life, when my daughter needs me to walk her through life, When I have grandchildren, I want to watch grow up." He paused, wiping tears from his eyes. "But listening to your story, I realize I've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why God is letting me die, maybe I should be asking how He wants me to live with whatever time I have left." 6 months later, Robert Martinez passed away peacefully in his sleep. But those final months of his life were transformed. Instead of dying angry and bitter, he spent his remaining time strengthening his relationships, sharing his faith with his grandchildren, and helping other cancer patients find hope in their darkest moments. At his funeral, Sarah asked me to speak. Standing before that congregation, I talked about how Robert had taught me that miracles aren't always about dramatic healings. Sometimes they're about finding peace in suffering, hope in despair, and meaning in the face of mortality. Robert's miracle, I said, wasn't that his cancer was cured. His miracle was that he died as a man of faith, surrounded by love, having used his final months to bless others facing similar battles. As I returned to my seat, I realized something profound. David's miracle had saved more than just David's life. It had rippled outward, touching Robert's final months, strengthening Sarah's faith, inspiring their church community, and transforming a skeptical surgeon into a man who could speak about God's presence in both healing and dying. 1 year after Robert's death, I received an invitation that completed my transformation. The medical school at UT Southwestern wanted me to guest lecture a course called Spirituality and Medicine. They wanted me to share David's case and discuss the role of faith in healthcare. Standing before a classroom of future doctors, I saw myself 25 years earlier, brilliant, confident, convinced that science had all the answers. These young men and women were about to enter a profession that would challenge them, exhaust them, and sometimes break their hearts. They needed to understand that healing involves more than just medical knowledge. "Today I want to tell you about the most important case of my career," I began. "Not because of the surgical techniques involved, but because of what this case taught me about the relationship between medicine and faith." I told them David's complete story, about the construction worker who died for 24 minutes, about the family that never stopped praying, about the recovery that defied all medical explanation, about the atheist surgeon who learned to see God's hand in healing. "As future physicians," I concluded, "you'll be trained to rely on evidence, protocols, and scientific reasoning. These things are essential, but you'll also encounter mysteries that textbooks can't explain, recoveries that don't make sense, outcomes that seem impossible. When those moments come, and they will come, I encourage you to remain open to the possibility that healing involves forces beyond our current understanding." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Rodriguez, how do you balance scientific skepticism with religious faith? Aren't they contradictory?" I smiled, remembering asking similar questions myself. "They're only contradictory if you see them as competing for the same space. But in my experience, faith doesn't replace science. It humbles it. Faith reminds us that we're participants in something larger than ourselves, that our knowledge and skills are gifts meant to be used in service of something greater." After the lecture, several students approached me with their own questions about faith and medicine. One young man, about to begin his surgical residency, said something that took me back to my own early career. "Dr. Rodriguez, I grew up in a religious family, but medical school has made me question everything I once believed. How do I hold on to faith in a profession that seems to explain everything through science?" I thought about my answer carefully. "Don't let science kill your sense of wonder," I told him. "The more you understand about the human body, the more miraculous it should seem that any of us are alive at all. Faith and medicine aren't enemies. They're both expressions of the same desire to understand and participate in the mystery of life." 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call that brought David's story into the present moment. It was Sarah, calling from the hospital. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "We're here for Gabriel's heart surgery." My blood ran cold. "Heart surgery? What's wrong?" "He was born with a small defect that needs to be corrected. It's routine, but we wanted you to know. And doctor, we have a special request. Anything. Would you pray with us before the surgery? Our whole family is here, just like that night 2 years ago." and we want you to be part of our prayer circle this time." An hour later, I stood in the pediatric wing of Dallas Methodist Hospital, holding hands with David and Sarah's extended family, forming the same kind of prayer circle I'd once dismissed as meaningless ritual. But this time, I wasn't watching from the outside with skeptical eyes. I was part of it, adding my voice to theirs, asking God to guide the surgeon's hands that would repair baby Gabriel's heart. Gabriel's surgery was performed by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, one of the finest pediatric cardiac surgeons in Texas. As I watched her work through the observation window, I found myself praying continuously, not just for Gabriel's healing, but for Dr. Walsh's wisdom, for steady hands, for successful outcomes. The surgery took 3 hours. When Dr. Walsh emerged from the operating room, she was smiling. "Perfect repair," she announced to the waiting family. "Gabriel's heart is now completely normal. He should have no limitations whatsoever." As the family celebrated, Dr. Walsh approached me. "Dr. Rodriguez, I heard you were here. Are you related to this family?" "In a way," I said. "They've become very special to me." "I have to tell you something strange," she continued. "I've performed hundreds of pediatric heart surgeries, but this one felt different. I felt incredibly calm, incredibly focused, almost like I had extra guidance." She paused, looking puzzled. "Does that sound crazy?" I smiled, thinking about my own experience in operating room 7 2 years earlier. "Not crazy at all, Dr. Walsh. Sometimes we get help from sources we don't expect." Today, as I write this story, Gabriel is a healthy, active 2-year-old with a perfectly functioning heart. Michelle is 4, starting preschool, and constantly asking her parents when they're going to have another baby. David is thriving in his construction work, and Sarah recently finished nursing school, inspired by what she witnessed during David's recovery to pursue a career in healthcare. But the most profound change isn't in their family, it's in me. I attend Mass every Sunday now, often with my mother, sometimes alone. I pray before every surgery, not as a replacement for medical preparation, but as recognition that healing involves more than human effort alone. My relationship with my mother has been completely restored. She no longer worries about her son who lost his faith. Instead, she marvels at God's perfect timing in bringing me back to Him. We pray together over the phone every Sunday evening, thanking God for the miracle of David's recovery and asking for wisdom in my work as a surgeon. Last month, I did something that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. I started a support group at the hospital for medical professionals struggling with questions of faith and spirituality in healthcare. We meet once a month, sharing stories, discussing the intersection of science and faith, and supporting each other through the emotional challenges of our profession. The group has grown from 3 people to over 30. Doctors, nurses, therapists, technicians. All of us trying to understand how to maintain both scientific integrity and spiritual openness in our work. Some weeks we discuss cases that defied medical explanation. Other weeks we talk about finding hope when medicine reaches its limits. Dr. Patricia Chen, the neurologist who'd been so puzzled by David's brain scans, joined our group 6 months ago. "Miguel," she told me during one of our meetings, "I've been thinking about David's case for 2 years now. I've reviewed similar cases in medical literature, consulted with colleagues around the world, even contacted researchers studying near-death experiences." "What did you find?" I asked. "Nothing that explains what happened to David. But I did find something else. Peace with not having an explanation. For the first time in my career, I'm comfortable saying I don't know when asked about certain recoveries. And I'm open to the possibility that some healings involve factors beyond our current scientific understanding. That's the gift David's miracle gave to all of us who witnessed it. Not just the obvious gift of a life saved and a family restored, but the deeper gift of humility before mystery, openness to the impossible, and recognition that the work of healing often involves forces greater than our individual efforts. If this story touched you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone in wondering if miracles really happen, if prayers are really answered, if God really works through doctors and nurses and medical professionals who dedicate their lives to healing others. I'm here to tell you they do. I've seen it with my own eyes, felt it in my own heart, and lived it in my own transformation from skeptic to believer. Some things belong not only to science, but to life and faith. And sometimes, when I'm preparing for a particularly challenging surgery, when the odds seem impossible, and the family is gathered in prayer outside my operating room, I think about that October night when David's heart stopped beating. I think about 24 minutes of flatline becoming a lifetime of gratitude. I think about prayers whispered in hospital hallways being answered in ways that no medical textbook could predict. And I smile, knowing that I'm about to participate in the beautiful mystery of healing once again, where science and faith work together to create outcomes that neither could achieve alone. Some things belong not only to science, but to life and faith. For never giving up on me. For praying for 23 years for a son who stopped believing. For having faith when I had none. She was quiet for a moment before responding. Miguel, a mother's love never stops, and neither do a mother's prayers. I always knew God would find a way to reach your heart. I just never imagined he would use a construction worker named David to do it. As I reflect on that incredible night, I realize that everything changed in those 24 minutes when David's heart was still. Not just for him, not just for his family, but for me. I walked into that operating room as a surgeon who believed only in science. I walked out as a man who understood that the greatest healings happen when medicine and faith work together. Some things belong not only to science, but to life and faith. I still perform surgery with the same precision and skill I always have. I still study medical journals, still stay current with the latest techniques and technologies. But now I also pray. Now I also believe. Now I understand that being a healer means being open to miracles, even when they don't make sense, especially when they don't make sense. David and his family changed my life that October night. They showed me that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in the patient, but in the doctor. Sometimes God uses our patients to save us. If this story touched you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone in wondering if miracles really happen. I'm here to tell you they do. I've seen one with my own eyes, felt one with my own hands, and lived one with my own heart. And sometimes, when I'm scrubbing in for a particularly difficult surgery, when the odds are stacked against us, and the family is gathered in prayer outside my operating room, I think about that night in October. I think about David's flatline becoming a heartbeat. I think about prayers being answered in ways that textbooks can't explain. And I smile, knowing that I'm about to witness God work through medicine once again. Some things belong not only to science, but to life and faith.